They say you can't put a price on family. My daughter-in-law Jessica proved that wrong, $620,000 to be exact. When my son Brian called saying he'd sold their house and needed to stay a few days, I never imagined I'd open my door to find a U-Haul full of their belongings and a woman who'd already planned to take over my entire life. Within a week, Jessica was spending my money, rearranging my furniture, and hosting parties in my living room like she owned the place. When I told them to leave, she laughed in my face. When I stood my ground, she slapped me so hard my glasses flew across the room. That was her first mistake. Her second was underestimating a 65-year-old former high school principal who'd spent 30 years dealing with bullies. What Jessica didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything, and what she couldn't have known was that her perfect crime was about to unravel in ways that would land her in federal prison. This is the story of how I took down a predator, saved my son, and proved that you should never, ever underestimate the woman who raised him. My name is Margaret Barnes. I'm 65 years old, and for 30 years, I served as principal of Hartford West High School in Connecticut. I thought I'd seen every kind of problem a person could face until the day my own son brought a monster into my home. I suppose I should start at the beginning, when life still made sense. When Robert was alive and our little colonial on Maple Street felt full of laughter instead of memories. When Brian would show up every Sunday with groceries and that crooked smile that reminded me so much of his father. The house hasn't changed much since Robert died 8 years ago. The rose garden he planted still blooms every June, though I tend it alone now. My bookshelves in the den still hold those old administrative binders from my principal days. Incident reports, documentation logs, the detritus of 3 decades managing teenagers and their parents. Old habits die hard. I kept everything organized then, and I keep everything organized now. It's just how my mind works. These days, my life has a comfortable rhythm. Wednesday mornings are book club at the library, where 6 of us retired women argue passionately about whatever novel someone picked. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, I volunteer at that same library, helping kids with homework. My neighbor Helen, she's 72, lost her husband around the same time I lost Robert, comes over most evenings for tea on the porch. We watch the neighborhood kids bike past and talk about everything and nothing. It's a quiet life, a peaceful life. Or it was until that Thursday evening in October when my phone rang and everything changed. "Hi, Mom." Brian's voice sounded strange, tight, like he was forcing the words through a too small space. "Sweetheart, I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight." I set down my tea, immediately alert. 30 years as a principal teaches you to recognize when something's wrong, even over the phone. "Is everything okay?" Yeah, everything's fine. I wanted to let you know that I sold the house." For a moment, I couldn't process the words. Brian and Jessica had bought that beautiful colonial in West Hartford 3 years ago, right after they got married. $620,000. I'd cried when Brian called to tell me the offer was accepted, tears of pride that my son had achieved such success. "You sold it." "But Brian, the market's so good right now," I thought. "I know, Mom, it's complicated. Listen, I was wondering if Jessica and I could come stay with you for a few days, just to rest, get our bearings while we figure out our next steps." Something in his voice made my stomach tighten. My son has always been honest with me, almost to a fault. But right now, he sounded like one of my students trying to explain away a forged absence note. "Of course you can stay, honey. You know you're always welcome. But where's all your furniture, your things?" "Jessica's handling all that. She's got it under control." He said her name quickly, almost nervously. "We'll come Saturday if that's okay. Around noon. Brian, what's really going on? Nothing, Mom. I promise. Just some changes, that's all. We'll explain everything when we see you. Jessica's calling me. I gotta go. Love you. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there in my kitchen staring at my phone, that familiar principal's instinct telling me something was very wrong. Brian hadn't sounded like a man making exciting life changes. He'd sounded like a man making excuses. I called Helen immediately. She came right over, and I poured out my concerns over chamomile tea. Maybe they're just overwhelmed, Helen said gently, patting my hand. Moving is stressful. They probably just need some family time. You know how Brian loves your cooking. I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. But when Saturday arrived and I opened my front door to find that U-Haul trailer packed to bursting with furniture and boxes, when I saw my son looking gaunt and exhausted, and when I met Jessica's cold, calculating smile, I knew with absolute certainty that Helen had been wrong. This wasn't a visit. This was an invasion. And the battle for my home and my son's soul was about to begin. Margaret has just opened her door to find Brian and Jessica arriving with a U-Haul full of belongings, far more than needed for a short visit. She's immediately suspicious, but maintaining her composure, drawing on years of experience as a principal dealing with difficult situations. She's a widow living alone in her family home, financially stable and fiercely protective of her son. At this moment, she's trying to understand what's happening while keeping her alarm in check. The contrast between them was striking. Brian looked like he'd aged 5 years in the 3 months since I'd last seen him. His face was pale, almost gray, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He'd lost weight, his shirt hung loose on his frame. But it was his eyes that truly frightened me. They were empty, defeated. Jessica, on the other hand, looked like she'd just stepped out of a spa. Her blonde hair had fresh highlights that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She wore expensive athleisure, the kind with designer labels, and her nails were perfectly manicured in a trendy nude shade. She practically glowed with satisfaction. "So much stuff," I said, keeping my voice light as I counted 8 massive suitcases being unloaded from the trailer, plus boxes, and even some furniture pieces. "Are you two going on a long vacation?" Jessica's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Not a vacation, Mom Margaret. We'll be staying here for a while, maybe several months depending on how things go." Several months? The words hit me like cold water. Brian still hadn't made eye contact. He was staring at his shoes like they held the secrets of the universe. "Well," I said, drawing on every ounce of principal composure I'd ever possessed, "why don't you both come inside and we'll talk properly? I'll make some lunch." I'd started a roasted chicken that morning, somehow knowing I'd need comfort food. It was Brian's favorite, had been since he was 10 years old. I thought maybe the familiar smell would bring him back to himself, remind him of who he used to be. While the chicken finished cooking, I set the dining room table with my good china. Jessica had already claimed the living room sofa, scrolling through her phone while Brian hauled boxes upstairs. He didn't ask which room to use. Apparently, that decision had already been made. Lunch was excruciating. I carved the chicken, served roasted vegetables, poured water into crystal glasses. Everything normal on the surface. Everything wrong underneath. "So," I said, passing the potatoes, "tell me about selling the house. That's such a big decision." Brian opened his mouth, but Jessica spoke first. "We sold it in August. Got $620,000. Can you believe it? The market was insane." "That's wonderful," I said carefully. "And what are your plans with, after the mortgage we cleared about $510,000? Jessica's eyes gleamed. "I've invested it in an amazing opportunity." My modeling and influencer career is really taking off, and I needed capital for professional photographers' portfolio building travel to casting calls in New York and LA. The returns are going to be incredible. I looked at Brian. He was pushing chicken around his plate, hadn't taken a single bite. "But Brian," I said gently, "that was both your money. What about your plans, your future?" Jessica laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Brian agreed to support my dreams. He has a steady income from his job. This is an investment in our future together." "Did you agree to this, sweetheart?" I asked Brian directly. He finally looked up. "It's fine, Mom. Jessica knows what she's doing." His voice was hollow. This wasn't agreement. This was resignation. After dinner, as I started clearing plates, I tried one more time. "Listen, I'm happy to have you visit, but why don't I book you a nice hotel for a few days? Something comfortable while you look for a new place. My treat." Jessica actually laughed out loud. "Mom, Margaret, we don't have money for rent right now. The investment is tied up. We'll stay here until my career takes off. Could be 6 months, could be a year. But don't worry, we won't be any trouble." The room spun slightly. "Jessica, I never agreed to. You won't throw your own son out on the street." Her voice had gone cold. All pretense of sweetness vanished. "What would people say? What would your church friends think? What would the neighbors whisper?" She knew exactly which buttons to push. Brian finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, I'm sorry. It's just temporary. We'll figure something out soon, I promise." But there was no conviction in his words, only defeat. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, to throw them both out right then. But shock had paralyzed me, and underneath the shock was a growing, terrible realization: my son was trapped. And somehow, I'd just become trapped too. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard Jessica's voice through the guest room wall. She was on the phone and she wasn't bothering to keep her voice down. "I know, right? This place is huge. No, she's not going to do anything. Yeah, the old lady's too worried about what people think. This is even better than I planned. We can stay as long as we need to." Her laughter drifted through the wall, cold and triumphant. I lay there in the darkness of my bedroom, the room I'd shared with Robert for 40 years, and understood with absolute clarity this wasn't desperation. This was a calculated invasion, and Jessica had been planning it all along. Connection to previous part. The previous section ended with, "I lay there in the darkness of my bedroom, the room I'd shared with Robert for 40 years, and understood with absolute clarity this wasn't desperation. This was a calculated invasion, and Jessica had been planning it all along." Current context. Margaret has just endured her first sleepless night since Brian and Jessica moved in. She's now aware that Jessica deliberately manipulated this situation, but she's still processing the shock and trying to understand the full extent of what's happening. As a former principal accustomed to maintaining order and authority, she's deeply unsettled by the loss of control in her own home. She's also caught between her protective instincts toward Brian and her growing alarm at Jessica's behavior. Margaret is entering a week of escalating boundary violations that will force her to take a stand. I thought Monday morning would bring clarity. Instead, it brought chaos. I came downstairs to find my living room transformed. The sofa I'd chosen with Robert 30 years ago had been shoved against the opposite wall. My mother's antique side table was relegated to a corner. In their place sat Jessica's modern white furniture, angular and cold. "What happened to my living room?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Jessica breezed past me toward the kitchen phone in hand. "Oh, I rearranged a bit. It flows better this way. You'll get used to it." She didn't ask. She just did it. By Wednesday, I'd discovered she'd hammered nails into my dining room wall to hang 3 enormous mirrors, the kind influencers use for outfit photos. The walls I'd painted with Robert the summer before he died now had holes that would need patching. Thursday morning, I walked into my master bathroom, my private sanctuary, to find it unrecognizable. Ring lights flanked my sink. Cosmetics covered every surface. Hair tools dangled from hooks she'd installed without asking. The shower was coated in residue from expensive products I'd never heard of. "Jessica, this is my bathroom," I said when I found her in the kitchen. "I know, but the guest bathroom doesn't have good lighting. I need it for content creation." She said it like I was supposed to understand, like it was perfectly reasonable to commandeer someone else's private space. Brian was already at work. He left early every morning and came home late, avoiding the house as much as possible. I couldn't blame him, but his absence left me alone with Jessica's expanding occupation. Friday night, I learned the invasion wasn't limited to physical space. Around 7 o'clock, the doorbell started ringing. 4 women arrived, each one dressed like they were attending a photo shoot, each one loud and entitled. Jessica had invited them for what she called an influencer planning session, without mentioning it to me. The music started at 8. By 9, they were shrieking with laughter. By 10, empty wine bottles littered my coffee table. I found one of them taking selfies in front of Robert's bookshelf using his leather-bound classics as props. At 11, I'd had enough. I walked into the living room in my bathrobe. "Ladies, I hate to interrupt, but I need to get some sleep. Could you please keep it down?" Jessica turned to me with exaggerated sympathy. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, she said to her friends, "Sorry, guys, the landlady is cranky tonight." They all laughed. Actually laughed at me. In my own home. The humiliation burned through me like acid. I retreated to my bedroom, but sleep was impossible. Their cackling voices followed me through the walls. The next morning, while cleaning up their mess, I noticed something else. My grocery bills had tripled. I'd been vaguely aware that food was disappearing faster than usual. But when I checked my credit card statement, I discovered multiple Whole Foods deliveries, $300 here, $250 there. Organic everything. Expensive wines. Lobster tails I certainly hadn't ordered. When I confronted Jessica, she was filing her nails on my sofa. "Jessica, you need to contribute to food expenses. These bills are astronomical." She looked up with theatrical shock. "Are you seriously nickel and diming your daughter-in-law right now? That's so petty, Mom Margaret." "This isn't about being petty. It's about respect and responsibility. Brian is your son. Family helps family." But the utility bills told another story, too. The air conditioning ran constantly, even when no one was home. Jessica took 2 showers a day, each one lasting 30 minutes, emptying my hot water heater. My electric bill had doubled. I felt like a guest in my own home, a stranger in the house where I'd raised my son, where I'd loved my husband, where I'd built 40 years of memories. On Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after they'd arrived, I called them both into the living room. Brian looked miserable. Jessica looked annoyed. I stood before them, channeling every ounce of authority I'd wielded as a principal. "We need to establish some rules. First, ask permission before changing anything in my house. Second, contribute $800 a month for expenses. Third, find your own apartment within 1 month." Jessica's face darkened like a storm cloud, but then she laughed that same brittle, false sound. "You're joking, right? Brian is your son. Family doesn't charge rent." "This isn't charity," I said firmly. "You're adults. These are my terms." "You're being heartless." Jessica shot to her feet. "We're struggling and you're—" She grabbed Brian's arm. "Come on. I can't believe this." She dragged him toward the stairs. Brian never said a word, never looked at me. Just followed her like a puppet on strings. Her voice carried down from the guest room, shrill and accusing. "I told you your mom is selfish. I told you she'd do this." I stood alone in my living room, surrounded by the wreckage of my reorganized life, and felt something shift inside me. Something that had been patient becoming hard. Something that had been kind becoming strategic. That night, I pulled out one of my old administrative binders from the den. I labeled it simply documentation. Then I began writing. Every incident, every boundary crossed, every dollar spent, every disrespectful word. I noted dates times witnesses when applicable. 30 years as a principal had taught me one essential lesson: if you're going to fight, fight with evidence. The next morning, I went to check my wallet for another reason entirely. My credit card was missing. And when I logged into my bank account and saw the statement, my hands started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped my phone. Margaret has just completed her first week with Jessica and Brian in her home. She's shifted from shocked tolerance to active documentation, drawing on her principal's instincts to build a case. She's established boundaries that Jessica immediately violated, and she's beginning to understand that this situation is far more serious than a difficult daughter-in-law overstaying her welcome. She's about to discover outright theft, which will trigger her investigative instincts and lead her to uncover the full scope of Jessica's criminal operation. Her relationship with Brian is strained. She can see he's suffering, but doesn't yet understand the full extent of his entrapment. $3,200 in 5 days. I scrolled through the charges with mounting horror. Nordstrom, $1,400. Sephora, $680. A string of expensive restaurants in Hartford, $200 here, $300 there. A hair salon appointment for $350, and something called Tesla rental service, $200 per day for 3 days. My credit card. The one I kept in my wallet for emergencies. The one I'd used last week to buy groceries and then tucked safely back into the billfold compartment. Except it hadn't been safe at all. I found Jessica in the living room, examining her freshly manicured nails in the morning light. "Jessica, did you use my credit card?" She didn't even have the grace to look guilty. "Oh yeah, I needed a few things. I thought you said you'd support my career. Consider it an investment in my image." The casual admission stunned me. "Jessica, that's theft. You took my card without permission and spent over $3,000. Don't be so dramatic, Mom Margaret. I'll pay you back when my influencer income starts rolling in. It's basically a loan. I want the money back. Now." She actually laughed. "I don't have money right now. Everything's invested in my future. When I'm famous, I'll pay you back double, triple even." She said it like she was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful for the opportunity to fund her delusions. I stood there vibrating with fury I couldn't fully express and understood something fundamental. Jessica had no shame, no boundaries, and no intention of ever paying me back. That afternoon, while Jessica was out at what she called a networking lunch, I called my old friend Linda. Her daughter worked in the entertainment industry in New York. She'd know if Jessica's modeling career was legitimate. Linda was tactful. "Margaret, I hate to say this, but it sounds like a scam. Real agencies don't ask for money up front. Let me have Emma make some calls." 2 days later, Linda called back. "Emma checked around. Nobody's heard of Jessica Reeves in the modeling world. Want me to recommend a private investigator? Sometimes it helps to know exactly what you're dealing with." I'd never hired a PI before. It felt like something from a movie, not real life. But I gave him everything I had: names, dates, the house sale, Jessica's supposed investment. 1 week later, he sent me a report that made my blood run cold. Jessica's Instagram had 3,400 followers, most of them bots. She'd done exactly 3 amateur photo shoots in the past 6 months, paid $200 to $300 each. No agency representation, no legitimate bookings, no career. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was buried in the financial analysis. In September, 3 weeks after selling the house, $480,000 had been wire transferred from Brian and Jessica's joint account to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account in Jessica's name only, an account Brian couldn't access. 510,000 minus 480,000 left only $30,000. Gone in 2 months on designer clothes, luxury dinners, and apparently rent on some apartment I knew nothing about. This wasn't a wife supporting her dreams. This was premeditated theft. This was an exit strategy. I waited until the following Tuesday, when Jessica announced she was going to another networking lunch. The moment her car disappeared down Maple Street, I called Brian's cell. "Can you come home? I need to talk to you. It's important." 20 minutes later, we sat in my garden surrounded by Robert's roses. I handed Brian the PI report. I watched my son's face as he read, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his hands start to tremble. When he got to the page about the offshore account, he actually made a sound, a small, broken noise that came from somewhere deep in his chest. "I didn't know about that account," he whispered. "Mom, I swear I didn't know. She said she invested in a modeling agency startup. She showed me papers, documents, everything looked legitimate, but I couldn't access the account. She said it was in her business name for tax purposes." "Brian, do you understand what this means? She's planning to leave you and disappear with the money." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I've been afraid of that for months, but I don't know what to do. She has things, Mom. Photos, videos, times when I was drunk or angry or said things I shouldn't have said. She records everything. She tells me if I try to leave, if I try to fight back, she'll destroy my career. She'll send everything to my boss, to my colleagues. She'll make sure everyone knows I'm a failure." My heart shattered. This wasn't just manipulation. This was systematic psychological abuse. This was blackmail. How long has this been going on? Since last year, maybe longer. I don't even know anymore. I just know I'm trapped and I don't see a way out. I reached for his hand. "Brian, we're going to fix this. I promise you." The front door slammed. Through the kitchen window, I saw Jessica standing there, phone pressed to her ear, staring directly at us in the garden. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the rage on her face. She knew. Somehow she knew we were talking about her. And the look in her eyes told me the war had just begun. Margaret has just shown Brian the PI report, revealing Jessica's offshore account and fake career. Brian has broken down and confessed he's being blackmailed with compromising videos and photos. They're sitting in the garden having this private conversation when Jessica unexpectedly returns home early and spots them through the window. Margaret now understands the full scope of the situation. This is domestic abuse, financial fraud, and blackmail, not just a difficult family situation. She's moved from documentation mode to protective mother mode, but she hasn't yet formulated her legal strategy. Jessica is about to confront them, and Margaret will see the full extent of her daughter-in-law's cruelty and manipulation for the first time. Jessica stepped out onto the patio, her heels clicking against the stone. Her voice dripped with false sweetness. "What are you two chatting about so seriously out here, having secrets from me, Brian?" Brian's hand went limp in mine. I felt him shrinking physically, pulling away. That's when I knew this was the voice he feared, the one that preceded punishment. "We were discussing your finances," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Specifically, the $480,000 you transferred to an offshore account without Brian's knowledge." The mask didn't just drop, it shattered. Jessica's smile turned feral. "Oh, you hired a detective. How very Nancy Drew of you, Mom Margaret." She pulled her phone from her designer purse, tapped a few times, then held it up. "Yes, I moved the money. It's my money now. Brian signed everything over to me because he loves me. Want to see the documents?" She scrolled through images, bank transfers, financial powers of attorney. even their marriage certificate all marked up with Brian's signature. Papers he'd signed when she'd manipulated him, pressured him, broken him down piece by piece. "What are you going to do about it?" Jessica's eyes glittered with malice. "Sue me. Brian would have to testify against his own wife. Tell me, Brian, do you have the guts to do that?" Brian said nothing, just stared at the ground like a condemned man. "I didn't think so." Jessica's voice turned sing-song taunting. "And even if you tried, I have insurance. Videos of Brian drunk saying terrible things about his colleagues, recordings of him threatening me. Oh, and my personal favorite footage of him pushing me during an argument. Sure, I provoked him for 20 minutes first, but my video only shows his hands on me. Domestic violence from a finance professional. That plays great with HR departments." My blood went cold. She'd weaponized everything. Every weak moment, every loss of control, every human reaction to her systematic torture. "Do you want your son's career destroyed?" Jessica stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Because I can make that happen with one upload. One email. His boss, his clients, everyone he's ever worked with, they'll all know what kind of man Brian really is." "Please," Brian's voice cracked. "Please don't do this. I won't interfere with the money anymore. Just don't hurt Mom. Please." Jessica turned to him, and her expression was pure ice. "Then tell your mother to back off. We're staying here as long as I want. She needs to accept it. You need to make her accept it." I watched my son crumble. This confident young man who'd graduated top of his class, who'd bought a house at 35, who'd had the world ahead of him, reduced to a broken shell, begging his abuser for mercy. And I understood then this wasn't a marital problem. This was a hostage situation. Brian wasn't weak. He was systematically abused, terrorized, and controlled by a woman who'd turned love into a weapon. But unlike Brian, I wasn't trapped by shame or fear. And unlike Jessica, I knew how to fight back. I stood up, drawing myself to my full height. I channeled every ounce of authority I'd wielded across 3 decades of facing down angry parents, manipulative students, and entitled board members who thought they could intimidate me. "Jessica, you and Brian have exactly 2 weeks from today to find new housing. After that date, I will take legal action to evict you. This is my final warning." Jessica threw her head back and laughed. Actually laughed. "You won't do anything. You're too weak. You're the type who's terrified of what people think. What will the neighbors say when you throw your own son out on the street? What will your church friends whisper? What will your book club ladies think of you then?" She was right about one thing I cared what people thought. I'd spent my whole life building a reputation in this community, but she was wrong about what I'd sacrificed to protect it. I didn't respond. Didn't engage. I simply turned and walked back into my house with my head high and my spine straight. The same walk I'd used 100 times escorting expelled students out of my office. Calm. Controlled. Final. Behind me, I heard Jessica's voice. "See Brian? She's all talk. She won't do anything." But she was wrong. As I closed the door behind me, I made a decision. I would save my son through tough love, even if he hated me for it temporarily. Even if it meant he'd have to face public embarrassment. Even if it meant weathering the whispers and judgment. Sometimes love means being the villain in someone else's story. Sometimes it means choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. 2 weeks. I gave her 2 weeks. Jessica didn't pack a single box. Instead, she grew bolder. More parties. More charges on credit cards I'd now had to cancel. More takeovers of my space. She treated my home like her personal kingdom and Brian like her servant. On day 15, I got in my car and drove to downtown Hartford. I parked in front of an office building I'd visited only once before many years ago. The brass plaque beside the door read, "Catherine Chen, Attorney at Law." Catherine Chen, the toughest family law attorney in Connecticut, the woman who never lost a case, and someone who owed me more than she could ever repay. Connection to previous part. The previous section ended with, "On day 15, I got in my car and drove to downtown Hartford. I parked in front of an office building I'd visited only once before many years ago. The brass plaque beside the door read, Catherine Chen, Attorney at Law." Catherine Chen, the toughest family law attorney in Connecticut, the woman who never lost a case, and someone who owed me more than she could ever repay. Current context. Margaret has just given Jessica a 2-week ultimatum to leave, which Jessica openly mocked and ignored. For 15 days, Margaret has watched Jessica grow bolder and more abusive, while Brian sinks deeper into helplessness. Margaret has reached her breaking point and made the decision to take legal action. She's arrived at Catherine Chen's office carrying her documentation binder, the PI report, and a determination to fight back. She's transitioning from shocked victim to strategic warrior, drawing on her decades of experience as a principal who dealt with difficult people and legal threats. She's about to reconnect with a former student whose life she once saved, creating a powerful alliance. I sat in Catherine Chen's waiting room surrounded by leather furniture and framed diplomas, and let my mind drift back to 1998. 27 years ago, I'd been principal for 13 years by then, thought I'd seen every kind of crisis a high school could produce. Then Catherine walked into my office with bruises on her arms and terror in her eyes. Those years taught me everything I needed to know about fighting. Not just student fights, though I'd broken up plenty of those, but the kind of fights that happened in conference rooms and courtrooms. The embezzlement scandal in 2008 when our school treasurer stole $40,000. The parent in 2010 who threatened to sue because I'd suspended her son for bringing marijuana to school. I'd won both battles the same way: meticulous documentation, ironclad evidence, and the steel to stand my ground when people tried to intimidate me. I'd spent 30 years building cases against people who thought they were untouchable. I'd learned to recognize manipulation document abuse and know exactly when to bring in lawyers. Jessica had no idea who she was dealing with. "Ms. Barnes," the receptionist smiled. "Catherine will see you now." Catherine Chen stood as I entered her office. At 48, she'd grown into the confident woman I'd always known she could become. Her handshake was firm, but when our eyes met, hers filled with tears. "Ms. Barnes? After all these years, you're still Ms. Barnes to me." "Hello, Catherine." She gestured to the leather chairs by her window overlooking downtown Hartford. "I heard you retired 5 years ago. How are you? I've been better." I set my binder on her desk. "I need help, Catherine, and I didn't know where else to turn." She sat forward, instantly focused. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about Brian's phone call, the U-Haul full of belongings, Jessica's systematic takeover of my home. I showed her the credit card statements, the PI report about the offshore account, the documentation I'd been keeping of every incident. When I finished, Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, voice thick, "Ms. Barnes, do you remember what you told me in 1998 when I wanted to transfer schools because I couldn't face my bullies anymore?" I remembered. Catherine had been a brilliant 16-year-old, but 3 girls had made her life hell. Her parents were ready to uproot her, transfer her to a private school across town. I'd called her into my office and said words I'd almost forgotten. "I told you that running away doesn't stop bullies, it just gives them permission to hurt someone else. You said, we're going to fight this together and we're going to win." Catherine's voice wavered. And we did. You expelled those girls, you changed school policy. You personally mentored me through the darkest period of my life. You wrote the recommendation letter that got me into Yale Law. She stood and walked to her window. Ms. Barnes, I became a lawyer because of you, because you showed me that the system works when good people refuse to back down. Catherine! She turned back to me, and now her tears were falling freely. Whatever you need, I owe you my life. You saved me when no one else would. Now let me save your son. The relief that flooded through me was almost painful. I need to save Brian from his wife, and I need to do it without destroying him in the process. Then that's exactly what we'll do. Catherine sat down and pulled out a legal pad. Her demeanor shifted from emotional to razor sharp. Let's talk strategy. This is an unlawful detainer case. At its core, they're guests who overstayed, not legal tenants. Connecticut law is very clear, but we can make this much bigger. She began writing rapidly. Multi-prong approach. First, civil lawsuit, eviction, theft, fraud claims. Your credit card statements are evidence of theft. The PI report about the offshore account is potential fraud. Second, criminal complaints. Credit card fraud is absolutely prosecutable in Connecticut. Third, we coordinate with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. That's money laundering territory. Fourth, if Jessica escalates, and I think she will, we file for an emergency protective order. What about Brian? I asked. He's terrified of her. She has videos recordings. That's domestic abuse, and it changes everything. Catherine looked up from her notes. We need to document it thoroughly. We separate Brian from liability and paint him as the victim. He is not a co-conspirator. The blackmail material she's holding over him, that's coercion. That's extortion. That makes her crimes even worse. She pulled out a thick folder. I'm going to prepare initial documents tonight. You'll need to sign affidavits, provide sworn statements. We'll move fast, file everything simultaneously so she can't prepare a defense. We hit her with civil and criminal actions at once. How long will this take? If we do it right, we could have her out of your house within 2 weeks and facing criminal charges within a month. Catherine's smile was sharp. I don't lose, Ms. Barnes. You taught me that. I left her office an hour later with a folder full of documents to review and sign a timeline of next steps, and something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. More than hope. Power. But I had one more stop to make. The PI report had mentioned something I needed to verify in person. Tom Richardson, Brian's colleague and former best man. If anyone knew the truth about Jessica's past, it would be him. I drove to the investment firm where Brian worked, parked outside, and sent Tom a text. 20 minutes later, he slid into my passenger seat, his face drawn with guilt. Mrs. Barnes, I should have told you this a long time ago, he began. What he told me in the next 30 minutes added a devastating new dimension to Jessica's crimes and gave me the final piece of evidence I needed to bury her. Margaret has just left Catherine's office feeling empowered with a legal strategy. She's now armed with documentation skills from her principal days and the backing of a top attorney. She's in full investigative mode, having already hired a PI and now seeking information from people who knew Jessica before Brian. Tom is about to reveal information he's been sitting on for years, information that will transform Margaret's understanding of Jessica from bad wife to career criminal. Margaret is methodical, strategic, and increasingly confident that she can win this fight. She's no longer defensive. She's on the offensive. Tom's hands gripped his coffee cup so tightly, I thought it might crack. We sat in a corner booth at a diner 3 blocks from his office, away from prying eyes and workplace gossip. I should have fought harder to make Brian listen, he said, staring into his untouched coffee. I should have done more than just show him the article and walk away when he got angry. What article, Tom? He pulled out his phone and scrolled through saved files. This, from the Miami Herald, June 2018. He turned the screen toward me. The headline read, "Local Doctor Loses Life Savings in Alleged Romance Scam." The accompanying photo showed a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, standing outside a courthouse. The article detailed how Dr. Richard Foster had met a woman named Jessica Hartley at a medical conference, married her within 6 months, and lost over $200,000 before she disappeared. Charges were filed, but eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. "Jessica Hartley," I said slowly, "not Reeves. Look at the physical description in the article. 5'6", blonde, late 20s at the time. The photo was blurry, but it looked enough like her that I couldn't ignore it." My blood ran cold. "You showed Brian this before the wedding. 3 months before, he got furious. Said I was jealous because I'd introduced him to my ex-girlfriend last year, and it hadn't worked out. He accused me of trying to sabotage his happiness." Tom's voice cracked. "We were best friends since college. After that conversation, he barely spoke to me. I wasn't even sure he'd ask me to be best man, but Jessica insisted on it. I think she wanted to keep me close, make sure I didn't cause trouble. Is there more?" My college roommate's friend guy, named Marcus, he dated someone matching Jessica's description in 2019. Lost $50,000 over 4 months. She told him she needed money for a business venture, then vanished. Marcus was too embarrassed to report. It just wanted to forget it happened. When I told Brian about that too, he said I was making things up. I sat back processing. This wasn't a woman who'd gotten greedy in one marriage. This was a pattern, a career. Jessica was a professional predator who targeted successful men, drained them, and moved on. Thank you for telling me this now, Tom. I've felt sick about it every day. When Brian called me last month saying they'd sold the house and needed to stay with you, I knew something was wrong, but we're not close anymore. He won't take my calls." I squeezed his hand. "You tried. That's more than most people would have done." When I got home, Jessica's car was gone, and Brian's wouldn't return until evening. I went straight to my den and pulled out a fresh 3-ring binder. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "Documentation, Jessica Reeves, Wassail Hartley." For the next 3 hours, I worked with the systematic precision I'd honed over 30 years. Every incident since they'd arrived went into chronological order with dates, times, and details. I printed photos I'd taken on my phone. Jessica's rearranged furniture, the holes in my dining room wall, the ring lights in my bathroom. I attached receipts for every grocery delivery, every utility bill, every credit card charge. I printed our text message exchanges and highlighted the ones where Jessica refused to contribute financially or dismissed my concerns. I wrote detailed notes about conversations, including who was present as potential witnesses. I even printed weather reports for relevant dates to establish timeline accuracy. This was what I'd done in 2008 when our school treasurer was stealing from us. This was what I'd done in 2010 when that parent threatened to sue. Document everything. Make it impossible to deny. Build a case so tight that no judge, no jury, no defense attorney could poke holes in it. By late afternoon, I had a 3-inch binder of evidence. I made 3 copies on my home printer, my training screaming that originals could be lost or destroyed. 1 copy would go to Catherine. 1 would go in my safe deposit box at the bank. 1 would go to Helen's house for safekeeping. The next day, I met Catherine at her office again. When I laid the binder on her desk, her eyes widened. "Margaret, this is extraordinary. I've never seen a civilian prepare evidence this thoroughly. Prosecutors would kill for documentation like this. 30 years as a principal teaches you a few things." We reviewed the timeline together. Catherine would prepare the initial legal filings by Friday, serve papers the following Monday. We're moving fast before she can hide more assets or prepare defenses, but we need one more piece. Something beyond the credit cards. We need evidence of felony-level theft. That's when it hit me. A cold, sick feeling in my stomach. "My jewelry box," I whispered. "What about it?" "I haven't checked it since they arrived. I keep it in my bedroom closet. There's a ring in there, my great-grandmother's diamond ring, 2 carats, worth $85,000 according to the insurance appraisal I had done in 2022. Catherine leaned forward. "Has Jessica been in your bedroom? She took over my bathroom. She's been in there constantly. Go home right now and check. If it's missing, we file a police report immediately. Theft over $5,000 is a Class B felony in Connecticut. That's 1 to 20 years. I drove home faster than I should have. My hands shook as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, as I opened my closet, as I pulled down the mahogany jewelry box that had belonged to my mother. Inside were my everyday pieces, my pearl necklace, my silver bracelet, my grandmother's brooch, but the small velvet box that held the diamond ring was gone. The ring Robert's grandmother had worn, the ring that had passed through 4 generations, the ring I'd saved for Brian to give to someone who truly loved him. Gone, and I knew exactly who had taken it. Margaret has just discovered the theft of her most precious family heirloom, an $85,000 diamond ring with irreplaceable sentimental value. She's already working with Catherine on building a legal case, has documentation of everything, and has recently installed security cameras on Catherine's advice. She's methodical, prepared, and ready to confront Jessica. Unlike earlier confrontations where she was caught off guard this time, Margaret is strategically prepared with evidence, legal backup, and recording capabilities. She knows this confrontation will likely escalate, and she's ready. Catherine has already advised her to have 911 pre-programmed and to stay calm no matter what Jessica does. Margaret is about to get the evidence she needs to put Jessica away for good. I called Catherine immediately from my bedroom, the empty jewelry box still open on my bed. The ring is gone. I need to confront her today while Brian's at work. "Wait," Catherine's voice was sharp. "Do you have cameras installed like I suggested?" "Yes. Hidden ones in the bedroom. Visible ones downstairs with the surveillance signs." "Good. Check the bedroom footage first. If we have her on video taking it, that's everything we need. And, Margaret, keep your phone recording during the confrontation. I'll stay on standby. If things escalate, hit the emergency call button we programmed." I found the footage within minutes. There was Jessica clear as day entering my bedroom yesterday afternoon. She went straight to the closet, opened the jewelry box, and slipped the velvet ring box into her designer purse. No hesitation, no guilt, just casual theft of an $85,000 family heirloom. I took screenshots, printed them, and waited until Wednesday morning. Brian left for work at 7:30. Jessica's car was still in the driveway. I had my phone in my pocket, recording app activated. Catherine was one button press away. I found Jessica in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone while drinking coffee from my favorite mug. "Jessica, we need to talk." She didn't even look up. "Can it wait? I'm planning content for today." I laid the printed screenshots on the counter in front of her. "You took my diamond ring. I have video evidence. That's felony theft. I want it back immediately." Her head snapped up. For a second, I saw genuine shock cross her face. Then it morphed into rage. "You're spying on me. You installed cameras. You're a paranoid, creepy old woman. You stole something that doesn't belong to you. The ring is worth $85,000. This is a felony. Return it right now or I'm calling the police." Jessica shot to her feet, her chair screeching against my tile floor. "You deserve to be alone. You're a controlling, manipulative witch. Your son is weak because you spoiled him, smothered him, never let him become his own man." I kept my voice level, though my heart was pounding. "The ring, Jessica, now!" "You know what?" Her voice dropped to something venomous. "I finally understand why your husband died so young. He wanted to escape you." Death was probably a relief. The world went white at the edges. She'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Robert. My Robert, who'd loved me for 40 years, who'd died in my arms on our kitchen floor. "Jessica, you have 5 minutes to pack your things and leave my house. If you're not gone, I'm calling the police." I reached for my phone. That's when she snapped. Jessica lunged across the kitchen island. Her hand connected with my right cheek so hard my head whipped sideways. I stumbled backward, my hip hitting the armchair in the breakfast nook. My glasses flew off and skittered across the floor. The taste of copper filled my mouth where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. Before I could react, she was on me. Her fingernails raked down my forearm, leaving burning trails. She grabbed my arm with both hands, shaking me. "You think you can destroy me? You're nothing, a pathetic old woman living in the past. You have no power here." But I did have power. Even as pain exploded through my face and arm, even as my ear rang and my vision blurred, I kept my head. I pressed the emergency button on my phone. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," I said quietly. Jessica heard the words, but not their meaning. She was still screaming when the sirens started barely 6 minutes later. Helen must have called too. I learned later she'd heard the shouting through our shared fence and dialed 911 immediately. Jessica's demeanor changed the instant she heard the sirens. The rage vanished, replaced by calculated composure. By the time the officers knocked, she was sitting on the sofa looking concerned. "Officers, thank goodness. My mother-in-law has been acting very strange. I'm worried about her mental state." But I had something Jessica didn't evidence. "Officers, I was assaulted by this woman. She stole from me, and when I confronted her, she attacked me. I have video footage of both incidents." The officers looked at my face. Already I could feel my cheek swelling. One officer, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, stepped closer. "Ma'am, you're bleeding. Can I see your arm?" I held out my arm. 3 angry scratches ran from my elbow to my wrist, already beginning to bruise, deep enough that they'd scar. Officer Martinez, her name tag read, took photos with a department camera. Photos of my cheek, my arm, my glasses on the floor with one lens cracked. Then she asked to see the video footage. I played it for them. Jessica entering my bedroom. Jessica taking the ring. And the second camera, the one in the kitchen, had caught everything that happened 15 minutes ago. The assault. The screaming. The moment Jessica's hand connected with my face. Officer Martinez's expression hardened. "Ms. Reeves, you're under arrest for assault on an elderly person and theft. You have the right to remain silent." Jessica's composure finally cracked. "You can't do this. She provoked me. Ma'am, we have video evidence of you striking her. Please put your hands behind your back." As they led Jessica out in handcuffs, she looked back at me with pure hatred. But there was something else there too. For the first time, I saw fear. After they left, after Helen rushed over with ice and tea, after I gave my full statement, I sat in my kitchen and called Catherine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. My face throbbed. My arm burned. But my voice was steady when Catherine answered. "File everything, now. Margaret has just been assaulted by Jessica and has video evidence of both the assault and the ring theft. Jessica has been arrested and taken away in handcuffs. Margaret is injured, swollen cheek scratches on her arm, cut inside her mouth. But she's clear-headed and determined. She's triggered the legal response she's been preparing for. Catherine is now actively filing all legal documents. Margaret is transitioning from victim to prosecutor, methodically building the case that will destroy Jessica. She's at the hospital getting her injuries documented when she'll remember the GPS chip, a technological advantage that will lead to discovering even more of Jessica's crimes. She's staying at Helen's house temporarily and will soon learn the full scope of Jessica's criminal history. Catherine picked me up within 20 minutes and drove me straight to Hartford Hospital's emergency room. My face had swollen to the point where my right eye was nearly shut. The scratches on my arm had started to bruise dark purple, blooming around the red welts. "We need every injury documented," Catherine said as we checked in. "Photos, doctors' reports, everything. This is evidence." The ER doctor, a young woman who introduced herself as Dr. Patel, examined me with gentle efficiency. She took detailed photographs of my cheek, my arm, the cut inside my mouth. She noted mild whiplash from how my head had snapped during the slap. "These injuries are consistent with assault," she said as she typed her report. "I'm sorry this happened to you." As I sat in the examination room waiting for discharge papers, something clicked in my memory. The ring, the GPS chip. "Catherine, call Mr. Steinberg Jewelers downtown. Tell him Margaret Barnes needs to speak with him urgently." She looked confused, but made the call, then handed me her phone. "Mr. Steinberg, this is Margaret Barnes. When I had my grandmother's ring appraised in 2022, you installed a GPS tracking chip. Is it still active?" There was a pause. "Mrs. Barnes, yes. Those chips have a 5-year battery life. It should still be transmitting. Let me pull up the tracking software." I heard keyboard clicks. "Yes, I have a signal. The ring is currently at 847 Brookside Avenue in West Hartford. Would you like me to send you the coordinates?" My hands shook as I wrote down the address. Not a pawn shop. A residential address in an upscale neighborhood 30 miles away. "Mr. Steinberg, can you provide documentation of the GPS installation and current tracking data? I'll need it for police evidence." "Of course. I'll email everything within the hour." The next morning, I met Catherine and the private investigator at the Hartford Police Department. With the tracking data and the theft report, we convinced a detective to accompany us to the address. The townhouse at 847 Brookside was elegant brick facade, manicured lawn, expensive cars in neighboring driveways. A woman answered the door, her face going pale when she saw the police uniforms. "Linda Chen?" the detective asked. "Yes. What's this about?" "Ma'am, we have reason to believe stolen property is in your possession. A diamond ring." Linda's hand went to her throat. "Oh my God, Jessica. She said it was hers." We sat in Linda's pristine living room while she told her story, her voice shaking. She'd met Jessica at a business networking event 6 months ago. Jessica had been charming, enthusiastic, full of ideas about investment opportunities. She gave me the ring as collateral for a loan 2 weeks ago, $15,000. She said it was a family heirloom from her grandmother, but she needed cash flow for her business. She promised to buy it back within a month. Linda retrieved the ring from her bedroom safe. My great-grandmother's ring, the one that had passed through 4 generations. Seeing it again made my throat tight. But Linda wasn't finished. "That's not all. Jessica introduced me to what she called an amazing investment opportunity, a company called Cascade Dynamics. It seemed legitimate, glossy brochures, professional website. I invested $40,000. Her voice broke. 3 weeks ago, I realized it was a pyramid scheme, an MLM scam. I've lost almost everything." Catherine leaned forward. "Do you have documentation, emails, text messages?" "Everything." Linda pulled out her phone. "Jessica was the one who recruited me. She got a commission for bringing me in. I have texts where she's coaching me on how to recruit others." Another victim. Not romantic like Brian, but financial. Jessica's web of deception was wider than I'd imagined. Linda provided a written statement to police and turned over months of correspondence with Jessica. The detective bagged the ring as recovered stolen property, though he assured me I'd get it back once the case was processed. Back at Catherine's office, she worked with fierce efficiency. Within 48 hours, she'd assembled a legal arsenal that would have made Sherman's march to the sea look gentle. Emergency protective order granted immediately by a judge based on assault evidence and documented fear of retaliation. Jessica was now legally barred from coming within 500 feet of me. Criminal complaints, assault on an elderly person enhanced charge because I'm over 60, and felony larceny in the first degree. The ring's $85,000 value made it a Class B felony carrying 1 to 20 years. Unlawful detainer lawsuit, immediate eviction proceedings against both Jessica and Brian, though Catherine built in provisions for Brian to separate himself. Civil lawsuit theft. Conversion of property fraud and emotional distress, seeking $150,000 in damages. I stayed at Helen's house while all this was processed. My bedroom there was smaller than mine, the bed less familiar, but Helen made sure I had everything I needed. She brought me tea and homemade soup and sat with me when the shock started to wear off and the fear crept in. Brian called me 17 times that first day. I finally answered the 18th. "Mom, I saw the photos. Your face, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Brian, where are you?" "At Tom's house. I can't go home. The protective order means Jessica can't be there and I couldn't stay in that house anyway." His voice cracked. "I want to bail her out. She's my wife. I know she's done terrible things, but Brian, stop." I made my voice firm. "If you bail her out, you're enabling her abuse. She assaulted your mother. She stole from me. She's stolen from you. If you bail her out, you're telling her that her behavior is acceptable." Catherine, listening on speakerphone, added, "Brian, your mother has a protective order. If Jessica is released and violates it, she goes right back to jail. Don't throw good money after bad." He was crying now. "I don't know who I am without her." "Then it's time to find out," I said gently. By Friday, I'd made another decision. I called the PI and requested a comprehensive background check on Jessica. Everything he could find. The files arrived Saturday morning. I spread them across Helen's kitchen table and began to read. Florida, Arizona, Texas, California. 7 men over 7 years. A trail of devastation that made my blood run cold. My son was just her latest victim, and I was going to make sure he was her last. Margaret is staying at Helen's house while the protective order is in effect. Jessica has been arrested and is in jail. Margaret has received the PI's comprehensive report showing Jessica's pattern of fraud across multiple states and victims. She's recovering from her physical injuries, but is mentally sharp and focused on building the case. Catherine is handling the legal filings. Brian is staying with Tom, separated from Jessica for the first time in years and beginning to process what happened to him. Margaret is about to discover that this case is even bigger than she thought. It's a federal crime involving an accomplice and millions of dollars. The police are executing a search warrant at her house, which will lead to the laptop discovery that changes everything. The call came Monday morning while I was having coffee at Helen's kitchen table, reading through the PI files for the 3rd time. Detective Morrison, from Hartford PD. "Mrs. Barnes, we're executing a search warrant at your residence for Jessica Reeves's belongings, per the protective order. Since you're the homeowner, we'd like you present if possible." I drove back to my house with Catherine. It felt strange walking through my own front door with police officers. They were professional, methodical, photographing Jessica's possessions before boxing them up. In the guest bedroom, one officer called out, "Got a laptop here, still powered on." "Don't touch it yet," Detective Morrison said. He looked at me. "Mrs. Barnes, this could contain evidence. With your permission, as the homeowner, we'd like to examine it. You have my permission. The laptop sat open on the nightstand, its screen glowing. Jessica had been in such a rush when the police arrived that she'd left it running, still logged into her email account. Detective Morrison carefully photographed the screen, then began scrolling through the inbox. His expression changed as he read. "Mrs. Barnes, you need to see this." I stood behind him, Catherine beside me, and read the emails between Jessica and someone named Marcus Lowe. They went back over 2 years. The early ones were cautious-coded. But as I scrolled, they became bolder. March email, target acquired. Finance sector, good income, owns property. Timeline, 6 months to marriage, 1 year to liquidation. August email. House sold. B signed everything. Moving to mother's place as discussed. Perfect setup, free housing while we drain remaining accounts. September email marked urgent M. Transferred Ford 80K as planned. Keep it safe until I can leave. Then we split and moved to Costa Rica like discussed. And Marcus's response, J. Good work. This is our biggest score yet. Remember, play the loving wife until we're clear. Don't let the old lady get suspicious. My stomach turned over. Brian wasn't just a victim. He was a target, a mark, a score. Detective Morrison was already on his phone. I need to contact the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. This is beyond our jurisdiction. The laptop was seized, sealed in an evidence bag, and logged. Within 3 days, I received a call from Catherine's office. Margaret, the FBI wants to meet with us, and they want Brian there too. The following Tuesday, we sat in a conference room at the FBI field office in New Haven. Agent Sarah Martinez was in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She laid out a series of file folders on the table. Mrs. Barnes, Mr. Barnes, thank you for coming. What started as a domestic assault case has become something much larger. She opened the first folder. Marcus Lowe is actually Marcus Chen, wanted for wire fraud in Florida and Arizona. And Jessica Reeves. Her real name is Jessica Hartley. She has outstanding warrants in multiple states. She spread out photographs. Over the past 5 years, we've identified 7 victims of what we believe is an organized romance fraud operation. Florida, 2017, Dr. Richard Foster lost $220,000. Arizona, 2018, James Patterson, small business owner, lost $180,000. Texas, 2019, attorney David Mills lost $310,000. She continued through 4 more victims, each story eerily similar to Brian's. Total theft, approximately $2.8 million. Jessica handles the front-end romance marriage access to accounts. Marcus handles the back-end offshore transfers, money laundering through shell companies covering digital tracks. Brian had gone pale. I was just one in a line. Mr. Barnes, you were a victim of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Agent Martinez's voice softened slightly. The good news is we've located their Cayman Islands account. We filed an international asset freeze last Friday. Marcus Chen has been tracked to Mexico. Extradition is in process, though that typically takes 6 months or more. What about the money? Brian asked quietly. Can any of it be recovered? We've frozen $1.6 million across various accounts. Much of it's been laundered, moved through shell companies, converted to cryptocurrency and back. But we're optimistic about recovery. She pulled out a chart. Best case, we recover 60 to 70%. You should eventually receive approximately $380,000, about 75% of what you lost. But the recovery process takes 4 to 6 months minimum, possibly longer. $380,000. Not the full $500,000, but enough for Brian to start over. Enough to prove that fighting back had been worth it. Agent Martinez looked at me. Mrs. Barnes, your documentation was instrumental. The evidence you provided gave us the foundation for warrant subpoenas international cooperation. Without your meticulous record-keeping, we might not have been able to build this case. How many other victims are there? I asked. Beyond the 7 you mentioned, we're investigating. Marcus's laptop may reveal more. Jessica's emails reference previous successful operations, but we haven't identified all victims yet. Some may not have reported the crimes out of shame. We left the FBI building 2 hours later with thick folders of case information and a timeline of what would happen next. The sky was gray, November clouds promising rain. Brian walked beside me in silence until we reached my car. Then he stopped. "Mom, I need to tell you something. I wasn't completely helpless in all this. I was scared, manipulated, but I wasn't stupid." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive. "For the past 2 months, I've been collecting evidence. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to get out." "What's on there?" "Recordings, photos, financial documents, everything I could gather without her knowing." His hands shook. "I've been carrying this in my wallet every day, terrified she'd find it. I was building my own case. I just didn't have the courage to use it until you showed me how." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the broken man from a few weeks ago, but someone who'd been quietly fighting back all along. He was stronger than either of us had known. Margaret has just learned that Brian has been secretly documenting Jessica's abuse for months. They're standing outside the FBI building after learning the full scope of Jessica's criminal operation, 7 victims, $2.8 million, stolen a partner named Marcus. Margaret's perception of Brian is shifting from broken victim to quiet survivor. They're about to go to Catherine's office to review Brian's evidence. Margaret is experiencing a complex mix of emotions, pride that Brian was fighting back grief, that he suffered a lone determination to use this evidence to destroy Jessica's defense completely. This is a pivotal moment in their relationship, the moment Margaret realizes she didn't fail her son. She taught him exactly what he needed to survive. We went straight to Catherine's office from the FBI building. Brian clutched the USB drive like it held his life, which, in a way, it did. Catherine closed her office door and drew the blinds. "Whatever's on here, it stays confidential until we decide how to use it. Brian, are you ready?" He plugged the drive into Catherine's laptop with shaking hands. The contents loaded dozens of folders meticulously organized by date and type. "I started in September," Brian said quietly. "After she made me sign papers transferring the house money. I knew something was really wrong then." The audio files came first. Catherine clicked on one dated October 15th. Jessica's voice filled the room, sharp and venomous. "Your mother is a pathetic old woman living in the past. When we take everything, I'll put her in the cheapest nursing home I can find. She deserves to rot alone." Brian's voice barely audible. "Please don't talk about my mom that way. I'll talk about her however I want. She's nothing. You're nothing. I own you. And you'll do exactly what I tell you, or I'll send those videos to your boss, your colleagues, everyone. Your career will be over." My hands clenched in my lap. Catherine reached over and squeezed my shoulder, but kept the recording playing. There were more. Hours of Jessica berating Brian, threatening him, laughing with Marcus about the marks, discussing exit strategies. In one, she told Marcus, "The old lady's tougher than expected, but Brian's completely broken. He won't fight back." But she was wrong. Because while she was mocking him, Brian was recording every word. The screenshots were next. Text messages between Jessica and Marcus planning everything. B signed the transfer papers. Crying like a baby, but he signed. "Get the Cayman account ready. We move everything by October 1st. After this score, we can take a year off before the next one." Then Brian's financial spreadsheet. Every charge Jessica made, every cash withdrawal, every unexplained expense, tracked with dates, amounts, and notes. Even the charges on my credit card were there. "How did you get all this?" Catherine asked. "I paid attention, took screenshots when she left her phone unlocked, kept receipts she threw away, made copies of documents she thought I didn't see." Brian's voice grew steadier as he talked. "I learned from Mom. She always said document everything. I just needed to find the courage to use it." I couldn't speak, couldn't find words for what I was feeling. Catherine kept clicking through files. Photos of the supposed blackmail material Jessica held over Brian's screenshots Brian had taken to neutralize their power. Journal entries detailing the psychological abuse, the coercion, the fear. "Brian, this is extraordinary," Catherine said. "But the recordings, Connecticut is a two-party consent state. She could argue they're inadmissible." "I know." Brian pulled up another folder. "That's why I made sure I had her consent. See these texts from September. She says, 'Fine record if you want, I don't care,' during an argument. She was so confident I'd never use it against her that she didn't care." Catherine smiled for the first time that day. "You're brilliant. This is all admissible." I finally found my voice. "Brian, you did all this while living in fear." He turned to me, tears streaming down his face. "Mom, I knew the marriage was wrong since last year. I was scared and ashamed, but I'm not stupid. When Jessica suggested moving in with you, part of me hoped you'd see through her, that you'd give me the push I needed to escape. Why didn't you tell me? Because I thought I was supposed to handle it myself. Be a man. Figure it out." He wiped his eyes. "But when you stood up to her, when you refused to back down, even when she tried to intimidate you, you showed me it was possible to fight back. You gave me permission to be strong." "I thought I failed you," I whispered. "I thought I should have seen it sooner." "No, Mom. You taught me everything I needed. Document the evidence, build your case, wait for the right moment. I just needed you to teach me one more thing, when to use it." Catherine was already uploading files to her secure server, making backup copies. With this evidence, Jessica has no defense. The recordings of her planning with Marcus, threatening you, admitting to the fraud, this is prosecutorial gold. She looked at us both. "The preliminary hearing is December 15th. I'm going to make sure these recordings are played in open court. Jessica's own words will convict her." I thought about that recording, Jessica's voice dripping with contempt, as she talked about putting me in a nursing home, about making me rot alone. "Play it all," I said. "I want the world to hear exactly who this woman is." Margaret has just reviewed Brian's secret evidence collection with Catherine. She's seen the depth of Jessica's cruelty through the recordings and is no longer hesitant. She wants full public exposure. It's been about 5 weeks since Jessica's arrest. Margaret's injuries have healed physically, though the emotional impact remains. She's moved from her initial shock and fear to a place of steely determination. Brian is living with Tom, attending therapy and slowly rebuilding. The preliminary hearing is about to begin, and Margaret is prepared to face Jessica in court for the first time since the assault. She knows Catherine has a strong case, but she's still nervous about seeing Jessica again and about the public nature of the proceedings. December 15th arrived, cold and gray. I stood on the steps of Hartford Superior Court with Catherine and Brian, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions we didn't answer. Inside the courtroom smelled of old wood and floor polish sounds echoing off high ceilings that had witnessed decades of justice. Judge Patricia Morrison entered precisely at 9 o'clock. She was in her early 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much human cruelty to be surprised by anything. Then they brought Jessica in. 5 weeks in jail had changed her. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit. Her hair hung limp roots, showing dark against bleached blonde. She'd lost weight, her face angular and hard. But her eyes, those were the same. Cold, calculating, defiant. Her new attorney, Raymond Burke, sat beside her. I'd heard of him aggressive, expensive, willing to try any tactic to win. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Linda Chen, presented our evidence methodically. Photos of my battered face, medical reports documenting assault on an elderly person, the PI's documentation of offshore accounts, laptop emails between Jessica and Marcus, my credit card statements showing thousands in fraudulent charges. Then she played Brian's recordings. Jessica's voice filled the courtroom, venomous and clear. Your mother is a pathetic old woman living in the past. When we take everything, I'll put her in the cheapest nursing home I can find. I watched the courtroom audience, about 30 people, including several reporters, react with visible shock. One woman actually gasped. Jessica sat motionless, but her jaw tightened. The recording continued. 3 minutes of Jessica threatening Brian, mocking him, discussing exit strategies with Marcus. Her own words condemning her more effectively than any prosecutor could. When it ended, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then Burke stood, and I felt my stomach drop. Your Honor, we move to dismiss these charges. My client was protecting her husband from ongoing financial abuse. He pulled out a folder. We have documentation showing that Mrs. Barnes financially controlled and exploited Brian throughout his life, forcing him to turn over earnings, creating a dependent relationship. The alleged assault was self-defense when confronted by an abusive mother. The courtroom erupted. Brian shot to his feet. That's a complete lie. Mr. Barnes, sit down, Judge Morrison said firmly. But I saw something in her eyes, anger at Burke's tactics. My hands were shaking. They were trying to paint me as the abuser, trying to twist everything. But Catherine stood, and her voice was ice. Your Honor, if I may address these absurd claims. What happened next was a masterclass in legal destruction. Catherine presented forensic analysis showing Burke's documents were forgeries, modern paper, digital manipulation, everything fake. She brought Brian's actual bank records, proving complete financial independence since age 22. She called 3 character witnesses who testified briefly but powerfully, Brian's childhood teacher, Helen, and Tom. Then she said 5 words that changed everything. I have one additional witness. The courtroom doors opened. A distinguished man in his 60s walked in, and I watched Jessica's face go white. Dr. Richard Foster had come to tell his story, and Jessica's carefully constructed lies were about to crumble into dust. Connection to previous part. The previous section ended with, then she said 5 words that changed everything. I have one additional witness. The courtroom doors opened. A distinguished man in his 60s walked in, and I watched Jessica's face go white. Dr. Richard Foster had come to tell his story, and Jessica's carefully constructed lies were about to crumble into dust. Current context. Margaret has just witnessed Dr. Foster's dramatic entrance at the preliminary hearing. His testimony devastated Jessica's defense and exposed her pattern of fraud. Judge Morrison ruled that Jessica would remain in custody and the case would proceed. Jessica's attorney, Burke, withdrew from the case. It's now 3 days after the hearing, and Margaret is back at her own home. The protective order means Jessica can't return. She's processing the victory at the hearing, but knows the legal battle isn't over yet. Brian is still staying with Tom, but visits Margaret regularly. They're both exhausted from the court proceedings and the emotional toll. Catherine has just called with news about a plea deal, forcing Margaret to make a decision about whether to accept justice now or push for a trial. Sigh. 3 days after the hearing, I was in my kitchen making tea when Catherine called. The house felt like mine again. I'd spent the previous weekend with Helen and Brian cleaning out every trace of Jessica's presence. The holes in my walls were patched. The furniture was back where it belonged. Even the air seemed lighter. Margaret, Jessica's new public defender, called. They want to discuss a plea deal. I sat down slowly. Tell me. Federal charges wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, plus state charges for assault and felony larceny. The offer is 12 years federal, 3 years state running concurrent. She'd serve 12 total eligible for parole after 8 or 9 years with good behavior. And if we go to trial, she's facing 25 years or more if convicted on everything, but trials are unpredictable, and it would take another year, maybe longer. You and Brian would have to testify, relive everything publicly. The recordings would be played repeatedly. It would be brutal. I closed my eyes thinking. 12 years. Jessica would be nearly 50 when she got out. Brian would be in his 50s. Our lives would have moved on completely. What does the public defender say? That Jessica would be insane not to take it. The evidence is overwhelming: the laptop, Brian's recordings, Dr. Foster's testimony, the FBI documentation. She has no defense. She'll lose at trial. Can I talk to Brian first? I called him that evening. He came over and we sat in the den where I'd once helped him with homework, where we'd celebrated his college acceptance, where we'd mourned his father together. What do you want to do? I asked. Brian was quiet for a long time. Mom, I want this over. I want to start healing. 12 years is justice. She'll be in prison longer than we were married. That feels right to me. You're sure we could fight for more? I'm sure. Going through a trial, having those recordings played over and over, watching her attorney try to destroy you on the stand, I can't do it. And I don't think you should have to either. He was right. The thought of months more of this, of being cross-examined, of having my life dissected publicly. I was 65 years old. I wanted my life back. Then we'll take the deal. Catherine filed the acceptance 2 days later. The sentencing hearing was set for February 14th. Valentine's Day. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. When that day came, Hartford Superior Court was packed. I sat in the front row with Brian on one side and Catherine on the other. Helen was there. Tom. Dr. Foster had flown in from Florida. Even some of the other victims Jessica had defrauded had come to witness this moment. They brought Jessica in wearing shackles. She looked thinner, harder, her eyes scanning the courtroom with something between defiance and fear. When her gaze landed on me, I didn't look away. I'd survived her, and now she would pay. Current context. Margaret has just attended Jessica's sentencing hearing on February 14th. Jessica received 15 years in federal prison and was led away in shackles. Margaret gave a victim impact statement and felt a sense of closure as justice was served. It's now early March, about 2 weeks after the sentencing. Margaret has returned to her normal life back in her own home. Brian is rebuilding his life with Tom's support and beginning therapy, and the immediate crisis is over. Margaret is in a reflective state, processing everything that happened and beginning to heal. She's feeling both exhausted and relieved, thinking the worst is behind them. She's about to receive an unexpected call from Dr. Foster that will challenge her capacity for compassion and present an ethical dilemma about how far her care should extend. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early March while I was deadheading roses in my garden. Spring was arriving tentatively, and I was learning to find peace in the small rituals that had once defined my life. The phone rang just as I'd finished pruning the last bush. Margaret, this is Richard Foster. I hope I'm not overstepping, but I learned something about Jessica I thought you should know. I sat down on my garden bench, still holding my pruning shears. What is it? After the sentencing, I couldn't let it go. I hired a private investigator to look into Jessica's full history. For closure, I suppose. And he found something. His voice was heavy. Margaret Jessica has a daughter. A 9-year-old girl named Emma. The words didn't make sense at first. A daughter. She's been in foster care in Phoenix for 4 years. The father is unknown, probably doesn't even know the child exists. Jessica abandoned her in 2020 when she moved on to her next victim. Emma's been bounced between 3 different foster homes. According to the social worker my PI spoke with, she has severe abandonment issues and trust problems. I couldn't speak. Jessica had a child. A little girl she'd thrown away like garbage when something better came along. I'm sending you the foster family's contact information, the Rodriguez family. They're good people, but Emma needs more than they can give her. I thought, maybe you'd want to know. This child is innocent in all of this. After we hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching the early crocuses push through the soil. A child. Jessica's child. The daughter of the woman who'd nearly destroyed my family. That evening, I made dinner for Brian, his first peaceful meal at my table in months. We sat at the kitchen table where we'd had so many conversations over the years, and I told him about Emma. His reaction was immediate. She had a child and abandoned her. What kind of monster? He stopped shaking his head. That poor little girl, she has no one. Dr. Foster thought we should know. But Brian, I don't know what we're supposed to do with this information. She's innocent, Mom. She didn't choose Jessica as a mother. She's a victim too, maybe the biggest victim of all. He looked at me with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than 38. Emma didn't ask to be born to a sociopath. I thought about my own values, the principles I'd held for 65 years. Children are never to blame for their parents' sins. I'd believed that as a principal, defending students from the consequences of their parents' failures. How could I believe it less now? What if we reached out, I said slowly. Not to adopt or take responsibility, we can't do that. But maybe. Letters, video calls. Show her that someone cares, she exists. Brian reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Mom, that would be an incredibly kind thing to do. And it might help us heal too. 2 weeks later, we were on a plane to Phoenix. Margaret and Brian have just made the decision to reach out to Emma Jessica's abandoned daughter. They've moved from anger at Jessica to compassion for an innocent child caught in the aftermath. It's late March, about 6 weeks after Jessica's sentencing. Margaret is in a reflective healing state. The immediate crisis is over, and she's beginning to think about legacy and what good can come from the trauma they endured. She's nervous about meeting Emma, unsure how to connect with a 9-year-old who's been abandoned and traumatized. Brian is with her, which gives her strength. This meeting will test Margaret's capacity for compassion and her belief that children shouldn't pay for their parents' sins. She's about to confront the human cost of Jessica's cruelty in the most heartbreaking way possible. The Rodriguez family lived in a modest ranch house in a quiet Phoenix neighborhood where desert landscaping replaced the green lawns I was used to. Maria Rodriguez answered the door with a warm but cautious smile. Her husband Carlos standing behind her. Mrs. Barnes. Mr. Barnes, please come in. Emma's in her room. She's nervous. The living room was clean but worn, filled with the kind of furniture that gets passed down through generations. Photos of foster children, dozens of them over the years, covered one wall. Maria and Carlos had been doing this for 15 years, she told us. Emma was their current placement. She knows you're connected to her mother, Maria said quietly. We couldn't hide it. She saw the news coverage. She's been having nightmares again. My heart clenched. We're not here to upset her. We just want her to know someone cares. Maria called down the hallway, and a moment later a small figure appeared in the doorway. Emma was tiny for 9, with big brown eyes that had seen too much, and brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans that were slightly too big, and a t-shirt that had been washed so many times the graphic was faded. In her arms, she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. I knelt down so I was at her eye level, remembering all the times I'd done this with frightened students in my office. "Hi, Emma. I'm Margaret, and this is Brian. We're not here to upset you or talk about your mom. We just wanted to meet you and see if maybe we could be friends." Emma studied me with those ancient eyes. "Are you mad at my mom?" The question was a test. She needed to know if we were safe. "Yes, sweetie. Your mom hurt people I love, but that's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." "Everyone says that." Her voice was so small. "But everyone still leaves." The words hit me like a physical blow. This child had learned that her existence wasn't enough to make people stay, that love was temporary, that she was disposable. "Emma, I can't promise to be your mom. I live far away in Connecticut, and you have a home here with Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez. But if you want, I can be your friend. We can write letters to each other, maybe video calls sometimes, and maybe you could visit Connecticut someday and see my garden." "Why?" The word was barely a whisper. "Why would you want to be friends with me? My mom did bad things to you." I reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. I took her small hand in mine. "Because you deserve to have people in your life who choose to stay, not because they have to, not because they're paid to, but because they want to, and Brian and I want to." Emma looked at Brian, who'd been quiet, letting me lead. He smiled at her gently. "I like your rabbit," he said. "What's his name?" "Hopper. His ear came off, but Mrs. Rodriguez sewed it back." "My mom taught me that things that are broken can be fixed," Brian said. "Even people." Emma looked between us, and I saw the moment she decided to take a chance. It was in the slight relaxing of her shoulders, the way she stepped a little closer. "Do you really have a garden like with flowers?" "Roses mostly, and in spring there are crocuses and tulips. I could send you pictures if you'd like." For the first time she smiled. It was small and uncertain, but it was real. "Okay, we can try being friends." If Margaret's story taught us anything, it's that courage doesn't have an age limit, and justice doesn't have an expiration date. A 65-year-old retired principal took on a professional con artist and won not just in court, but in reclaiming her life, saving her son, and even extending compassion to an innocent child caught in the wreckage. From the moment that U-Haul pulled into her driveway to the day Jessica was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, Margaret proved that documentation determination and refusing to be intimidated can defeat even the most calculated predator. But beyond the legal victory, this story is about transformation. It's about a woman who turned her pain into purpose, now helping other abuse victims find their voice. It's about a son who discovered his own quiet strength and is rebuilding his life with clear boundaries and renewed confidence. And it's about breaking cycles, showing a 9-year-old girl that not everyone believes that she has value, and that her mother's cruelty doesn't define her future. Now I want to hear from you. What moment in Margaret's story resonated with you most? Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family? Do you know someone who needs to hear this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you or might help someone you know, please share it. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more true stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when pushed to their limits. Remember Margaret's lesson: never mistake kindness for weakness. Document everything, and know that it's never too late to fight back. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.